My name is Natalie Rivers, and I am a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force. For 15 years, I've commanded respect in war zones across 3 continents, made split-second decisions that saved countless lives, and earned more commendations than I care to count. But none of that mattered to my family. To them, I was still the awkward girl who chose combat boots over high heels, strategy rooms over shopping malls, and service over suburbia. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They thought I was a disappointment. They had no idea I was about to become their reckoning. The morning of my cousin Marcus's funeral, I stood outside St. Michael's Cathedral in my dress blues, watching my own blood relatives laugh and embrace each other while treating me like I was invisible. The October wind cut through Cedar Falls, Colorado, sharp and unforgiving, much like the family that raised me. I wasn't welcome inside. Not because I hadn't been invited, but because every attempt I made to approach was met with cold shoulders, turned backs, and whispered conversations that died the moment I came near. My Aunt Patricia, Marcus's mother, had made it crystal clear through her silence. My Uncle Robert pretended not to see me. My cousin Stephanie, always the family princess, actually smirked when our eyes met across the parking lot. Even my own parents, Carol and David Rivers, stood with their backs to me, choosing sides in a war I never knew I was fighting. I watched them through the tall stained glass windows, these people who shared my DNA but not my values, as they comforted each other in their expensive black dresses and tailored suits. I stood alone on the cathedral steps, my uniform pressed to perfection, my posture straight despite the weight crushing my chest. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had served my country with honor, led missions that required nerves of steel, but I couldn't find a place among the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Marcus and I had been close once, back when we were kids running through the sprinkler systems in his backyard, building forts out of couch cushions, dreaming about adventures we'd have when we grew up. He wanted to be a race car driver. I wanted to fly jets. Only one of us lived to see those dreams take flight. He died at 28 in a motorcycle accident, sudden and senseless, leaving behind a wake of grief that somehow didn't include space for me. As I stood there feeling smaller than I had since basic training, I heard my Aunt Patricia's voice carry through the slightly open cathedral doors. Her words were meant to be private, but grief has a way of making people careless with volume. "I don't know why she even came," Patricia said, her voice thick with disdain. "Marcus barely talked about her anymore. She's been gone so long playing soldier, she doesn't even know who we are as a family." My Uncle Robert's response cut deeper. "Some people think a uniform makes them special. But look at her, standing out there alone. That tells you everything you need to know about her priorities." The worst part came from my own mother Carol, whose voice I recognized even through the heavy wooden doors. "I love my daughter, but she made her choices. She chose that life over this family. She can't expect to just show up when it's convenient, and have everything be the same." Something cold and final settled in my stomach as I listened to them discuss my worth like I was a stranger, like the blood we shared meant nothing, like the sacrifices I had made in service to something greater than myself, somehow diminished my right to grieve my cousin's death alongside them. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that I wasn't as alone as I appeared. Because while they had spent years pushing me away, I had built a different kind of family. A family that understood loyalty, sacrifice, and what it truly meant to have someone's back when the world turned dark. They were about to meet that family, and it would change everything they thought they knew about who I really was. Growing up in the Rivers family meant understanding your place in an invisible hierarchy that no one ever explained but everyone somehow knew. My cousin Stephanie was at the top, golden-haired and graceful, the kind of girl who never had to try hard because everything came naturally to her. She played piano like an angel, painted watercolors that my aunts hung on their refrigerators, and had a laugh that made adults lean in closer, wanting to be part of whatever joy she was experiencing. Then there was Marcus, wild and charming, the boy who could talk his way out of any trouble and into any heart. He was 2 years older than me, with dark eyes that sparkled with mischief and a grin that could melt the sternest grandmother. He was the family favorite among the grandchildren, the one whose stories got told and retold at holiday dinners, whose achievements were celebrated with expensive gifts and elaborate parties. And then there was me, Natalie, the quiet one, the one who asked too many questions about things that didn't matter to anyone else. The one who wanted to know how airplanes stayed in the sky, instead of how to apply lip gloss properly. The one who preferred reading about World War II aviation heroes to gossiping about classmates. I wasn't difficult or rebellious, I was just different, and in the Rivers family, different was another word for disappointing. I remember one particular Thanksgiving when I was 12 years old. The whole extended family had gathered at my grandparents' house in the Maple Ridge neighborhood, the kind of sprawling suburban home with cream-colored carpets and crystal decorations that made you afraid to breathe too hard. The adults were in the living room, nursing their second glasses of wine and discussing vacation plans, while the cousins were supposed to be playing quietly in the basement. Stephanie was showing off her latest dance routine, spinning and leaping across the finished basement floor, while the adults applauded from upstairs. Marcus was entertaining everyone with his impression of his math teacher, complete with exaggerated facial expressions that had even the grown-ups chuckling. I was sitting in the corner, reading a biography of Amelia Earhart that I had checked out from the library, completely absorbed in the story of a woman who had dared to fly when the world told her to stay grounded. My Aunt Patricia came downstairs to check on us, her heels clicking against the wooden steps. She cooed over Stephanie's dancing, ruffled Marcus's hair with obvious affection, and then noticed me tucked away with my book. "Natalie, honey," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone adults use when they're about to suggest something they think is good for you. "Why don't you put that book away and join the other kids? You're being antisocial." I looked up, confused. "I'm not being antisocial, I'm reading." "But family time is for family," she pressed her smile tight around the edges. "You can read any time, you can't get this time back with your cousins." What she didn't understand that I was perfectly happy in my corner with Amelia's story. I wasn't sulking or excluding myself out of spite. I was genuinely content, lost in a world where a woman could disappear into the vast blue sky and be remembered forever for her courage rather than her ability to make small talk at family gatherings. But I closed the book anyway. Because 12-year-olds don't have the vocabulary to explain that solitude isn't the same as loneliness, that being present doesn't always mean being loud, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections happen between a reader and the pages of a book about someone who understood what it meant to dream beyond the boundaries other people set for you. I tried to join Stephanie's impromptu dance lesson, stumbling through moves that came naturally to her, feeling clumsy and oversized in my jeans and sneakers while she floated across the floor in her carefully chosen outfit. I attempted to laugh at Marcus's jokes, but my timing was off, my responses a beat too slow. I wasn't good at performing for an audience, even an audience of family members. By the time dessert was served upstairs, I had retreated back to my corner, back to Amelia and her adventures. But this time, when the adults came down to collect us, my mother's expression was different. Disappointed. Embarrassed, maybe. "Natalie, we've talked about this," she said quietly as we walked to the car later that evening. "You need to make an effort. Family is important. People notice when you don't participate." I wanted to tell her that I had participated, that I had tried, that participation didn't have to look the same for everyone. But I was 12, and 12-year-olds don't always have the words for concepts that some adults never learn. So I nodded and promised to try harder next time, not understanding that what she really meant was that I needed to try to be someone else entirely. The pattern continued through my teenage years. Family gatherings became exercises in performance anxiety, where I was constantly aware of how I was being perceived, measured against cousins who seemed to navigate social situations as effortlessly as breathing. I learned to smile at the right moments, laugh at the appropriate times, and keep my more unusual interests to myself. When I announced during my senior year of high school that I wanted to join the Air Force, the reaction was swift and predictable. My parents exchanged the kind of look that parents share when their child has just announced they want to run away and join the circus. "The military?" my mother asked, as if I had suggested becoming a professional snake charmer. "Natalie, you're a smart girl. You could go to college, get a nice degree, meet a nice boy. Why would you want to do something so dangerous?" my father finished, though I could tell that wasn't the word he had originally intended to use. My Aunt Patricia, who happened to be visiting that day, was less diplomatic. "Honey, the military isn't really for girls like you. It's so rough, so masculine. You're delicate, you need something that suits your nature better." I wanted to laugh at the irony. I had never been delicate. I had always been the one willing to climb higher, run faster, push harder than was probably safe or smart. I had never been afraid of getting dirty, getting hurt, or getting in trouble for taking risks. But somehow, in their minds, my quiet intensity had been translated into fragility, my thoughtfulness mistaken for weakness. Marcus was the only one who seemed genuinely curious about my decision. "Why the Air Force?" he asked later that evening, when we found ourselves alone on the back porch. "I want to fly," I told him simply. "I want to see the world from above, where borders don't matter and everything looks small and manageable." He nodded slowly, and for a moment I thought he might understand. "That sounds pretty cool, actually. Like being a superhero." But even Marcus's support came with conditions. As the months passed and my commitment to enlisting became more serious, his enthusiasm waned. The family pressure was subtle but persistent, and eventually even he began to echo their concerns. "Are you sure you're not just doing this to prove something?" he asked me one afternoon. "Because you don't have to prove anything to anyone, Nat. You're fine just the way you are." The problem was that fine, just the way I was apparently meant, acceptable as long as I stayed in my designated place. It meant being the quiet cousin who didn't rock the boat, who didn't demand too much attention, who was content to exist on the periphery of other people's more interesting lives. But I wasn't content with that. I never had been. And as I sat through my final family dinner, before leaving for basic training, listening to Stephanie talk about her plans to study art history, and Marcus describe his new job at a local marketing firm, I realized that my choice to serve wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about proving something to myself. The morning I left for Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, only my parents came to see me off. No extended family, no cousins, no grand farewell. Just a quick hug from my mother, a firm handshake from my father, and a promise to write that we all knew would be kept sporadically at best. As the plane lifted off from Denver International Airport, I pressed my face to the small window and watched Colorado shrink beneath me, until it was just a collection of geometric shapes and winding lines. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was moving towards something instead of away from it, like I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be, rather than the person everyone else expected me to be. Basic training was everything they said it would be, and nothing like I had imagined. The physical demands were brutal but manageable. The mental challenges were constant but surmountable.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The social dynamics were complex but navigable. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued competence over charisma, who measured worth by performance rather than popularity. I discovered I was good at things I had never been allowed to explore. I could think strategically under pressure. I could lead when leadership was needed. I could make decisions quickly and live with the consequences. I could earn respect through action rather than birthright. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that family wasn't just about shared DNA. It was about shared values, mutual support, and unconditional loyalty. The men and women I served alongside became my brothers and sisters in ways that transcended biology, bound together by something stronger than blood, the choice to serve something greater than ourselves. I wrote letters home as promised. I sent pictures from training, from my first duty assignment, from various deployments. I called on holidays and birthdays. I tried to maintain the connections that had always felt so tenuous, hoping that my success might somehow bridge the gap that had always existed between who I was and who they wanted me to be. The responses were polite but distant, generic congratulations that could have been written to anyone. Updates about family events I wasn't invited to attend. News about Stephanie's gallery showings and Marcus's latest adventures, shared as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than a cousin, a daughter, a family member who had simply chosen a different path. Over the years, as I rose through the ranks and earned my commission, as I deployed to Kuwait and Germany and South Korea, as I made decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of people and earned decorations that represented real sacrifice and genuine achievement, the distance between my two worlds only grew wider. I learned to stop expecting them to understand what my service meant, to stop hoping they would be proud of the woman I had become, to stop measuring my worth by their approval. I built a life that was full and meaningful and important, surrounded by people who knew my value not because they were told they should love me, but because they had seen me prove myself worthy of their respect. But some wounds never fully heal, and some hopes never completely die. When Marcus died suddenly and senselessly, I thought maybe grief might do what years of achievement couldn't bring us together in our shared loss, unite us in our common love for a young man who had been taken too soon. I was wrong. Even in death, Marcus belonged to them in ways that I never could. Even in grief, there wasn't room for me at the table where his memory was being honored. Even in my dress blues, representing years of service and sacrifice, I was still just the cousin who had chosen wrong, who had prioritized duty over family, who had earned the right to stand alone. But they were about to learn something about the family I had chosen, about the bonds I had forged in the crucible of service, about what it meant to have people who would cross any distance and overcome any obstacle to stand beside you, when the world seemed determined to leave you standing alone. The sound that would change everything was still hours away, but as I stood outside St. Michael's Cathedral that morning, feeling the familiar weight of isolation settle around my shoulders, I had no idea that my real family was already mobilizing, already moving, already coming to remind everyone present that some bonds are stronger than blood, and some families are forged in fire rather than born in comfort. I had learned to carry disappointment like a second skin, but I was about to remember what it felt like to be truly seen, truly valued, truly loved by people who understood that family isn't about who raised you, but about who refuses to let you stand alone when the world tries to make you invisible. The wind picked up, cutting through the mountain air with the kind of sharpness that makes you grateful for warmth wherever you can find it. Soon, very soon, I would remember what that warmth felt like. The years that followed my departure for the Air Force were marked by a peculiar kind of silence. Not the comfortable quiet of understanding, but the hollow echo of conversations that never happened, celebrations that went unshared, and achievements that fell into the void of family indifference. I had learned to navigate combat zones and diplomatic complexities, but I never quite mastered the delicate art of maintaining relationships with people who seemed determined to misunderstand everything I represented. My first deployment to Kuwait came 8 months after I completed my initial training. The desert heat was relentless, the mission was critical, and the responsibility was overwhelming for someone barely 21 years old. I was tasked with coordinating supply logistics for a forward operating base, ensuring that equipment, ammunition, and essential supplies reached our troops when and where they needed them. Lives depended on my ability to solve complex puzzles under pressure, to anticipate problems before they became crises, to make decisions with incomplete information and absolute confidence. I thrived in that environment in ways that surprised even me. The chaos that might have paralyzed others seemed to sharpen my focus. The responsibility that could have crushed someone less prepared only made me more determined to excel. I discovered that I had an intuitive understanding of systems and logistics, an ability to see patterns where others saw only confusion, and a gift for inspiring confidence in people who outranked me and had decades more experience. When I called home to share news of my first commendation, the conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes. My mother congratulated me in the same tone she might have used if I had told her I passed a driving test. My father asked if I was eating enough vegetables. Neither of them asked what the commendation was for, what I had done to earn it, or whether I was proud of my accomplishment. The call ended with promises to stay in touch that we both knew would be kept sporadically at best. 3 weeks later, I received a 15-minute voicemail from my Aunt Patricia, describing in elaborate detail the flower arrangements Stephanie had created for a local charity auction. Every petal was discussed, every color combination analyzed, every compliment she had received repeated with obvious pride. The message ended with a casual mention that they missed hearing from me, as if the communication had ever been reciprocal, as if my attempts to share my world had ever been met with genuine interest or curiosity. The pattern continued through my second deployment to Germany, where I was promoted to staff sergeant and given responsibility for coordinating international supply chains across multiple NATO operations. The complexity of the work was staggering, requiring me to navigate not only military protocols but also diplomatic sensitivities, cultural differences, and language barriers. I learned to speak functional German, conversational French, and enough Italian to avoid international incidents during tense negotiations. I sent postcards from every city I visited, each one carefully chosen and personally written. From Munich I sent a card featuring the famous beer gardens, writing about how the locals had taught me to appreciate the engineering precision that went into their brewing processes. From Rome I shared a picture of the Colosseum, with a note about how standing in such an ancient place made me think about the continuity of human conflict and cooperation. From Paris, I sent an image of the Eiffel Tower with observations about how different the city looked from the air during our supply runs. The postcards were never acknowledged. Not once. I began to wonder if they were even being received, if perhaps there was some problem with international mail delivery. But when I called home for Christmas that year, my mother mentioned in passing that she had been collecting my cards in a shoebox, saving them for some unspecified future purpose. She didn't mention reading them, enjoying them, or sharing them with anyone else. They were simply objects to be stored, like old receipts or expired coupons. Marcus, at least, seemed genuinely interested in my adventures when we managed to connect during my rare visits home. He would ask questions about the places I had been, the people I had met, the challenges I had overcome. But even his curiosity felt filtered through the family's general incomprehension of my choices. He would listen to my stories with the same expression he might wear while watching a documentary about a foreign culture, intrigued but ultimately unable to relate to the experiences I was describing. During one visit, he asked me directly why I didn't just come home, find a normal job, settle down like everyone else. The question wasn't mean-spirited, but it revealed how little he understood about what I had become, about the sense of purpose and belonging I had found in the service, about the fact that I was already home in every way that mattered. I tried to explain that I wasn't running away from something but running towards something, that the Air Force had given me opportunities to grow and contribute in ways that would never have been possible if I had stayed in Cedar Falls. I told him about the young airmen I was mentoring, about the complex international relationships I was helping to maintain, about the satisfaction that came from solving problems that had real consequences for real people. He nodded and smiled, but I could see in his eyes the same polite confusion I had been encountering from family members for years. To them, my explanations sounded like elaborate justifications for an incomprehensible choice, rather than genuine expressions of passion and purpose. The distance between my two worlds became even more apparent when I was promoted to technical sergeant and selected for a prestigious assignment coordinating disaster relief operations across Southeast Asia. The work was challenging and meaningful, requiring me to coordinate with civilian agencies, international organizations, and local governments to deliver aid to communities devastated by natural disasters. I remember one particular mission in the Philippines, following a devastating typhoon. We had less than 72 hours to establish supply lines into remote villages that had been completely cut off from the outside world. The infrastructure was destroyed, the weather was unpredictable, and the local population was desperate for food, medical supplies, and clean water. Working 18-hour days, I coordinated helicopter drops, ground convoys, and boat deliveries to reach communities that had been written off as inaccessible by other organizations. We saved hundreds of lives during that operation, reunited families that had been separated by the storm, and restored hope to communities that had been forgotten by the world. When I called home to share the experience, hoping that maybe this time the significance of the work would translate across the cultural divide that separated my family's world from mine, the response was predictably disappointing. My mother expressed concern about my safety and language that suggested she viewed my deployment as an unnecessary risk, rather than a meaningful contribution. My father asked whether I was earning enough money to make the danger worthwhile, as if the value of saving lives could be measured in dollars and cents. Nobody asked about the families we had helped, the communities we had rebuilt, or the satisfaction that came from being part of something larger than myself. Nobody seemed to understand that I wasn't a victim of my circumstances, but an active participant in work that gave my life meaning and purpose. The emotional distance became even more pronounced when I earned my commission as a second lieutenant and was assigned to strategic planning operations in South Korea. The promotion represented years of hard work, additional education, and proven leadership ability. It meant that senior officers trusted me with responsibilities that affected thousands of people and millions of dollars in resources. I called home immediately after the promotion ceremony, hoping that perhaps this milestone would be significant enough to bridge the gap between their expectations and my reality. The conversation lasted exactly 6 minutes. My mother congratulated me, and then immediately changed the subject to discuss Stephanie's latest art exhibition, which had apparently received favorable coverage in the local newspaper. My father mentioned that he had seen my high school classmate at the grocery store, and that she was engaged to a nice boy from a good family. The subtext was clear. Other people my age were following traditional paths, meeting conventional expectations, achieving the kinds of success that could be easily understood and celebrated. My accomplishments, no matter how significant within my chosen field, would always be viewed as interesting, but ultimately incomprehensible detours from the life they had imagined for me. The years that followed brought additional promotions, more complex assignments, and increasingly significant responsibilities. I served as a liaison to international military organizations, coordinated joint training exercises with allied forces, and eventually found myself in charge of strategic planning for entire regional operations. Each achievement built upon the previous one, creating a career trajectory that would have been impossible to imagine when I first left Cedar Falls, as a confused and determined 18-year-old. But the professional success only served to highlight the personal isolation that had become a constant undercurrent in my life. I had colleagues who respected my abilities, subordinates who looked to me for guidance, and superiors who trusted me with important decisions. I had built friendships with fellow officers that were based on mutual respect, shared experiences, and common values. I had created a life that was challenging, meaningful, and fulfilling, in ways that I struggled to articulate to people who had never experienced similar purpose. Yet every phone call home, every holiday visit, every attempt to share my world with the people who had known me longest, served as a reminder that success and belonging are not the same thing. I could earn the respect of generals and diplomats, but I couldn't earn the understanding of my own family. I could coordinate complex international operations, but I couldn't navigate the simple dynamics of a family dinner without feeling like an outsider looking in. The breaking point came during my promotion to major, an achievement that represented not just personal success, but institutional recognition of my potential for senior leadership. The ceremony was held at Peterson Air Force Base, with fellow officers, distinguished guests, and military dignitaries in attendance. It was a proud moment, a culmination of years of hard work and dedication. I had sent my family detailed information about the ceremony weeks in advance, hoping that perhaps this time they might make the effort to attend, to witness firsthand the life I had built and the respect I had earned within my chosen profession. I even offered to pay for their travel expenses, to arrange accommodations, to make the visit as easy and comfortable as possible. The responses were polite, but predictable. My parents had prior commitments that couldn't be rescheduled. Stephanie was preparing for an important exhibition that required her full attention. Marcus expressed interest, but ultimately decided that the timing wasn't convenient. Even my Aunt Patricia, who had never hesitated to travel for Stephanie's various achievements, suddenly discovered pressing obligations that prevented her from making the trip. I stood at attention during the promotion ceremony, surrounded by people who understood the significance of the moment, feeling profoundly alone despite being in a room full of supporters. The officers who pinned the new rank on my uniform had traveled across the country to participate in the ceremony. Colleagues who had served with me in various capacities over the years had arranged their schedules to be present. Even junior officers I had mentored early in their careers had requested leave to attend. But the chairs reserved for my family remained empty, a visible reminder that the people who should have been most proud of my accomplishments were the ones who found them least worthy of their time and attention. That night, I sat alone in my quarters, staring at the new rank insignia, and trying to process the complex emotions that comes from achieving a significant personal milestone, while simultaneously confronting the reality that the people who had known me longest cared about it least. I had learned to compartmentalize disappointment, to focus on the positive relationships and meaningful work that filled most of my life, but moments like these had a way of cutting through even the most carefully constructed emotional defenses. I realized that I had been carrying a fantasy for years, a hope that eventually my family would recognize the value of the path I had chosen, that they would come to understand and appreciate the person I had become through years of service and sacrifice. But fantasies, no matter how deeply held, cannot survive indefinite contact with reality. The final betrayal, when it came, would be more devastating than simple indifference or misunderstanding. It would reveal not just that they didn't value my choices, but that they had been actively undermining my ability to make them. The discovery would change everything I thought I knew about the people who had raised me, and it would force me to confront truths that I had been avoiding for most of my adult life. But all of that was still months away. For now, I simply had to learn to live with the growing awareness that the family I had been born into would never be the family I needed, and that the love I had been seeking from them would have to be found elsewhere. among the people who had chosen to value me for who I was, rather than dismissing me for who I wasn't. The path forward would require letting go of expectations that had shaped my emotional landscape for decades, and learning to find validation from sources that were more reliable than blood relations and childhood connections. It would mean accepting that some relationships cannot be repaired through effort alone, and that sometimes the healthiest choice is to stop trying to force understanding where none exists. The lesson would be painful, but ultimately liberating, freeing me to invest my emotional energy in relationships that were reciprocal rather than one-sided, that were built on mutual respect rather than obligatory tolerance, and that recognized my worth rather than constantly questioning my choices. The seeds of that liberation had already been planted in the friendships and professional relationships that sustained me through years of family indifference. Soon, very soon, those relationships would prove their value in ways that would leave no doubt about where my true family really resided, and what kind of loyalty I could count on when the world seemed determined to leave me standing alone. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came not through dramatic revelation, but through a mundane Tuesday afternoon phone call from my bank. I had just returned from a 3-month deployment coordinating humanitarian aid operations in Eastern Europe, exhausted but satisfied with the mission's success. We had managed to establish sustainable supply chains into refugee camps, housing thousands of displaced families, work that required navigating complex political situations and logistical nightmares. I was unpacking in my small apartment near Peterson Air Force Base, looking forward to a hot shower and a full night's sleep in my own bed, when my phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional but concerned, a customer service representative, explaining that there had been unusual activity on my accounts that required immediate attention. At first, I assumed it was a simple case of fraud protection being overly cautious. Military personnel are frequent targets for financial scams, and banks have learned to flag any transactions that seem out of pattern. I expected to verify a few purchases, confirm my identity, and move on with my evening. Instead, I found myself staring at account balances that made no sense, trying to process numbers that couldn't possibly be accurate. My checking account, which should have contained 3 months of accumulated pay, plus my usual savings buffer, showed a balance of negative $4,000. My savings account, carefully built over years of modest living and automatic transfers, had been reduced to less than $200. My investment portfolio, a conservative collection of mutual funds I had been contributing to since my first promotion, showed recent liquidations totaling nearly $60,000. I hung up the phone and immediately logged into my online banking, certain that there had been some kind of technical error, that the representative had been looking at the wrong account, or that their system was displaying outdated information. But the numbers remained stubbornly consistent across every platform I checked. Someone had been systematically draining my accounts for months, taking advantage of my deployment to transfer funds, liquidate investments, and rack up charges that I had never authorized. The theft wasn't crude or obvious. Whoever had done this understood financial systems well enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. The transfers had been spaced out over time, the amounts carefully calculated to stay below the thresholds that would have prompted immediate bank intervention. Credit cards had been opened in my name, using information that only someone with access to my personal documents could have obtained. I spent the rest of that evening on the phone with various financial institutions, filing fraud reports, freezing accounts, and trying to trace the paper trail that would eventually lead to the identity of the person or persons who had betrayed my trust so completely. The process was humiliating in ways I hadn't anticipated, requiring me to prove my own identity while simultaneously demonstrating that I had been the victim, rather than the perpetrator of the financial crimes being investigated. The customer service representatives were sympathetic but clinical, walking me through procedures that had clearly been designed for situations exactly like mine. They assured me that investigations would be conducted, that fraudulent charges would be reversed, that the appropriate authorities would be notified. But beneath their professional reassurances, I could hear the implicit question that they were too polite to ask directly: how had someone gained access to enough personal information to commit such extensive fraud without my knowledge? The answer to that question would prove more devastating than the financial theft itself. Because as I began to piece together the timeline of the unauthorized transactions, cross-referencing them with my deployment schedule and the dates of various family interactions, a pattern began to emerge that I desperately didn't want to see. The first fraudulent charge had been made 3 days after I had called home to inform my family about my deployment to Eastern Europe. The largest single transfer had occurred on the same day I had spoken to my mother about my concern for maintaining my financial obligations while I was overseas. The most recent liquidation had happened within hours of a conversation with my Aunt Patricia about the rising costs of healthcare for aging family members. I tried to convince myself that the timing was coincidental, that there must be some explanation that didn't involve the people who had raised me systematically stealing from me while I was serving my country. I wanted to believe that the correlation between family conversations and financial theft was nothing more than an unfortunate pattern of circumstances that would eventually be explained by the discovery of some sophisticated criminal organization that specialized in targeting military personnel. But denial, no matter how comforting, cannot survive sustained contact with evidence. The more I investigated, the more obvious it became that the theft wasn't the work of strangers. The personal information required to open credit accounts in my name, the detailed knowledge of my financial habits necessary to avoid detection, the precise timing that coincided with my periods of limited communication, all pointed to someone with intimate access to my life and my trust. The breakthrough came when the bank's fraud investigation unit provided me with copies of the authorization documents that had been used to access my accounts. The signatures were good, close enough to mine to pass casual inspection, but I could see the subtle differences that revealed them to be forgeries. More importantly, I could see the addresses where financial statements and credit cards had been sent, addresses that belonged to members of my own family. I sat in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, surrounded by bank statements and credit reports, trying to process the reality that the people who had dismissed my achievements and ignored my successes had been secretly profiting from my absence. While I had been coordinating refugee relief operations, they had been helping themselves to the money I had earned through years of service and sacrifice. While I had been managing complex international logistics, they had been liquidating the investments I had been building for my future. The scope of the theft was staggering, not just in financial terms but in the level of planning and coordination it had required. This wasn't impulsive or opportunistic crime. It was systematic, sustained, and sophisticated. It required cooperation between multiple family members, access to documents I had entrusted to them for safekeeping, and a level of callousness that I struggled to reconcile with my memories of the people who had raised me. I tried calling Marcus first, hoping that somehow he might be able to provide an innocent explanation for what appeared to be inexplicable circumstances. The conversation was awkward from the beginning, filled with long pauses and evasive answers that only confirmed my worst suspicions. When I finally confronted him directly with copies of the fraudulent documents, his response was neither denial nor apology but justification. They had been helping me, he explained, managing my finances more effectively than I could from overseas. They had been investing my money more aggressively, taking advantage of opportunities that my conservative approach would have missed. They had been protecting my assets from the kinds of poor decisions that young people typically make when they have more money than experience. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it destroyed relationships that had taken decades to build. Marcus wasn't a co-conspirator who had been reluctantly drawn into someone else's scheme. He was an active participant who genuinely believed that his family had the right to make financial decisions on my behalf without my knowledge or consent, that my absence somehow invalidated my ownership of the money I had earned through my own labor and sacrifice. The calls to my parents and aunt followed similar patterns. Initial protestations of innocence gave way to elaborate justifications that revealed the depth of their sense of entitlement to my resources. They spoke about family obligations, about my responsibility to contribute to the collective welfare of people who had supported me through childhood, about the selfishness of accumulating money while refusing to share it with people who had greater immediate needs. None of them expressed remorse for the deception. None of them acknowledged that what they had done constituted theft rather than financial management. None of them seemed to understand that the real betrayal wasn't monetary but emotional, that they had violated my trust in ways that would be impossible to repair. My mother's response was perhaps the most painful because it revealed how little she understood about the life I had built or the values that guided my choices. She spoke about my military salary as if it were unearned income, something that had been given to me rather than something I had worked for. She described my frugal lifestyle as evidence that I didn't really need the money that had been taken, as if my choice to live modestly somehow justified their decision to spend lavishly. When I explained that the theft had jeopardized my ability to purchase a home, to plan for retirement, to build the kind of financial security that would allow me to transition from military service to civilian life, her response was immediate and dismissive. I was young, she said. I had plenty of time to rebuild whatever had been lost. I was capable and resourceful, characteristics that would allow me to recover from temporary setbacks. I was being dramatic about what amounted to a family disagreement over money management. The conversation with my Aunt Patricia was even more revealing because it exposed the underlying resentment that had apparently been festering for years beneath the surface of polite family interactions. She spoke about my choice to join the military as a betrayal of family expectations, a rejection of the values and priorities that should have guided my decisions. She described my success in terms that made it clear she viewed my achievements as undeserved, the result of preferential treatment rather than earned merit. According to her narrative, the family had been subsidizing my choices for years, providing emotional and financial support that had enabled me to pursue a career that served my own interests rather than contributing to the collective welfare of the people who had invested in my development. The money they had taken wasn't theft but compensation for years of unacknowledged support, payment for debts that I had been avoiding through geographical distance and emotional detachment. The most disturbing aspect of these conversations wasn't the lack of remorse but the genuine conviction that their actions had been justified, even necessary. They had convinced themselves that they were the victims of my selfishness rather than the perpetrators of my betrayal. They had created an elaborate mythology in which my financial independence was evidence of my moral failure, my success proof of my ingratitude, my distance confirmation of my fundamental selfishness. I realized that I was dealing with people who had never truly seen me as an independent adult with the right to make my own decisions about my own resources. Despite my rank, my responsibilities, and my demonstrated competence in complex professional situations, they continued to view me as a wayward child whose choices needed to be managed by wiser and more experienced family members. The decision to pursue legal action wasn't driven by vindictiveness but by necessity. The theft had been extensive enough to require formal intervention, and the complete absence of remorse made it clear that informal resolution would be impossible. I needed professional help to untangle the financial mess they had created, to restore my credit, and to ensure that they could never again access my accounts or use my identity for their own benefit. Finding the right attorney was crucial, and I was fortunate to connect with Lisa Morgan, a former military lawyer who specialized in financial crimes involving service members. She understood both the legal complexities of the case and the unique emotional challenges that come with being betrayed by family members who should have been providing support rather than taking advantage of absence and trust. Lisa's approach was methodical and thorough, building a case that would be impossible to challenge or dismiss. She brought in Thomas Bradley, a forensic accountant whose expertise in tracking complex financial transactions proved invaluable in documenting the full scope of the theft. Together they constructed a timeline that revealed not just the what and when of the crimes but the how and why, creating a comprehensive picture of sustained and coordinated financial abuse. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Bank records, credit applications, authorization documents, and communication records all pointed to the same conclusion. My family had been systematically stealing from me for over 2 years, using my deployments as opportunities to access my accounts and my trust as a weapon against my financial security. But even as the legal case took shape, even as the evidence mounted, even as the prospect of justice became increasingly realistic, I struggled with the emotional complexity of prosecuting people who had been part of my life since childhood. The decision to move forward with criminal charges felt like a final severing of connections that had already been stretched beyond repair, a formal acknowledgement that the relationships I had been trying to preserve were built on foundations that had never been as solid as I had wanted to believe. The choice between family loyalty and personal justice should have been easy, but it wasn't. Because despite everything they had done, despite the betrayal and the deception and the complete absence of remorse, some part of me still remembered what it had felt like to belong to something larger than myself, to be connected to people who shared my history and my blood, even if they had never shared my values or my vision for the future. Marcus's death changed everything. The phone call came at 3 in the morning, my Aunt Patricia's voice breaking as she delivered news that no parent should ever have to share. A motorcycle accident on a mountain road, sudden and senseless, the kind of tragedy that reminds you how fragile life really is, and how quickly everything you take for granted can disappear. My first instinct was to drop everything and rush home, to set aside the legal proceedings and the financial disputes and the emotional betrayals in favor of shared grief and mutual support. Death has a way of putting things in perspective, of making petty disagreements seem insignificant compared to the finality of loss. But when I called to express my condolences and ask about funeral arrangements, the reception was cold in ways that caught me completely off guard. The grief was real, but so was the resentment. The family that had been stealing from me for years was now treating me as if I were the one who had committed unforgivable crimes, as if my decision to seek legal redress for their theft somehow made me responsible for Marcus's death. The funeral arrangements were discussed in terms that made it clear I was not welcome to participate in planning or decision-making. The service would be private, they said, limited to people who had maintained close relationships with Marcus throughout his life. My presence would be disruptive, they suggested, a reminder of family conflicts that had no place in a setting dedicated to celebrating his memory. I understood that grief makes people irrational, that the shock of sudden loss can cause even reasonable people to lash out at convenient targets rather than processing their emotions in healthy ways. But understanding didn't make the rejection any less painful, and it didn't change the reality that I was being excluded from grieving the death of someone I had loved despite our differences. The decision to attend the funeral despite their objections wasn't driven by stubbornness or spite, but by a need to say goodbye to Marcus in my own way, to honor the relationship we had shared during childhood even if it had been strained in recent years. I had a right to grieve, and I had a responsibility to myself to process that grief in ways that felt authentic and meaningful. But I also knew that my presence would be controversial, that showing up uninvited would create tension and conflict at a time when the family was already struggling to cope with devastating loss. The solution, when it came to me, felt both appropriate and necessary. I would attend in uniform, representing not just myself but the values and commitments that had shaped my adult life, making it clear that I was there to honor Marcus rather than to participate in family drama. The morning of the funeral was gray and cold, typical October weather for the Colorado mountains. I stood outside St. Michael's Cathedral in my dress blues, watching my family gather on the steps, feeling like a stranger observing rituals that should have been familiar but somehow felt foreign and exclusionary. I could see them talking about me, their gestures and expressions making it clear that my presence was exactly the kind of disruption they had wanted to avoid. But I also knew that I had every right to be there, that excluding me from public mourning was neither reasonable nor sustainable, and that my uniform represented values and commitments that were worthy of respect even from people who had chosen to forfeit my trust. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have anticipated, was that I wasn't as alone as I appeared to be. Because while my biological family had been writing me out of their narrative, my chosen family had been writing me into theirs. The bonds I had forged through years of service, the relationships I had built through shared sacrifice and mutual respect, were about to prove their strength in ways that would leave no doubt about where my true loyalties resided, and what kind of support I could count on when the world seemed determined to leave me standing alone. The sound of approaching footsteps would soon change everything, but for now, I simply stood and waited, holding my grief close and my dignity closer, prepared to honor Marcus's memory regardless of whether anyone else thought I deserved the opportunity to do so. The first sound was subtle, barely distinguishable from the ordinary noise of morning traffic moving through Cedar Falls. A low rumble that seemed to emanate from the direction of the main highway, growing steadily more distinct as it approached the cathedral district. I noticed it before anyone else, because years of military training had taught me to be alert to changes in my environment, to distinguish between routine sounds and those that might signal something significant. The family members gathered on the cathedral steps were too absorbed in their own conversations to pay attention to anything happening beyond their immediate circle. They were discussing flower arrangements and seating charts, sharing memories of Marcus and coordinating the logistics of the reception that would follow the service. Their voices carried the particular mixture of grief and determination that characterizes people trying to maintain normalcy in the face of devastating loss. I remained where I was, standing at attention near the street, my dress blues immaculate, despite the morning chill. The October wind cut through the mountain air with a sharpness that reminded me of deployments to northern climates, where weather became another factor to consider in mission planning. I had learned long ago to maintain composure regardless of external conditions, to project confidence and readiness even when circumstances were less than ideal. The rumble grew louder, more focused, clearly distinct from civilian traffic patterns. It had the rhythmic quality of vehicles traveling in convoy formation, the synchronized precision that comes from professional drivers following strict protocols. I recognized the sound because I had heard it countless times during my years of service, the unmistakable signature of military vehicles moving with purpose and coordination. My family remained oblivious to the approaching sound, their attention focused inward on their own grief and the complicated dynamics that my presence had introduced to what should have been a straightforward memorial service. I could see them glancing in my direction occasionally, their expressions revealing varying degrees of resentment, confusion, and barely contained anger. They had made it clear that I was not welcome, and my decision to attend despite their objections was being interpreted as another example of my fundamental selfishness and disregard for family harmony. The convoy turned onto Cathedral Street with military precision, 10 identical black vehicles moving in perfect formation, their polished surfaces reflecting the gray morning light. Each vehicle bore the distinctive markings of official Air Force transportation, the kind of fleet reserved for high-ranking officers and ceremonial occasions. The sight was impressive enough to draw attention from passers-by, who stopped their morning routines to observe the unusual procession moving through their quiet neighborhood. The vehicles came to a simultaneous halt in front of St. Michael's Cathedral with the kind of coordination that can only be achieved through extensive training and professional discipline. Doors opened in unison, and Air Force officers began emerging from each vehicle, their movements synchronized and purposeful. They were dressed in full ceremonial uniform, their brass polished to mirror brightness, their bearing reflecting years of military service and unwavering commitment to excellence. The silence that had been gradually building around the cathedral steps suddenly became absolute. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, gestures froze in mid-motion, and every eye turned toward the extraordinary scene unfolding in the street. My family members stood transfixed, their expressions shifting from confusion to amazement, to something approaching disbelief as they tried to process what they were witnessing. 10 Air Force officers formed a precise line facing the cathedral, their positioning calculated to create maximum visual impact while maintaining appropriate respect for the solemnity of the occasion. Each officer represented years of distinguished service, their combined experience spanning decades of military operations, strategic planning, and leadership development. They stood at attention with the kind of bearing that can only be developed through sustained commitment to excellence and mutual respect. At the center of the formation stood General William Hayes, a man whose reputation extended far beyond Air Force circles into the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. His 4 stars gleamed against the dark blue of his dress uniform, and his presence commanded immediate attention from everyone within sight of the cathedral. He was not a man who made casual appearances or participated in routine ceremonies. His presence at this particular location, at this specific time, carried weight that was impossible to ignore or dismiss. The general stepped forward, with measured precision, his movements reflecting the gravity of the moment, and the significance of what was about to occur. He removed his cap with gloved hands, holding it against his chest in a gesture that combined military protocol with personal respect. His eyes found mine across the distance that separated us, and in that moment, I understood that this was not a coincidence or a mistake but a deliberate demonstration of values and loyalties that transcended blood relationships and geographical boundaries. The salute that followed was crisp, professional, and unmistakably respectful. General Hayes raised his hand to his brow, with the kind of precision that comes from decades of military service, holding the position long enough for everyone present to understand its significance. The gesture was not routine military courtesy, but a public acknowledgement of achievement, service, and mutual respect between officers who had earned their positions through demonstrated competence and unwavering commitment to duty.
The words that accompanied the salute carried across the morning air with perfect clarity, spoken in the kind of voice that had been trained to command attention in difficult circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Rivers, General Hayes said, his tone formal but warm, "We are here to honor both your cousin's memory and your continued service to our nation." The silence that followed his words was profound and telling. Every person gathered on the cathedral steps stood frozen in position, their faces reflecting various degrees of shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension. They were witnessing something that challenged every assumption they had made about my place in the world, my value as a person, and my significance within communities that extended far beyond the narrow boundaries of family relationships. My parents stood near the cathedral entrance, their expressions revealing the internal struggle between their long-held beliefs about my choices and the undeniable evidence of respect and recognition being displayed before them. My mother's hand had moved to her throat in an unconscious gesture of surprise, while my father's jaw had tightened in a way that suggested he was trying to process information that didn't fit comfortably into his existing understanding of the world. Stephanie, always concerned with appearances and social status, looked pale and uncertain, her usual confidence shaken by the realization that she might have fundamentally misunderstood the relative importance of our respective achievements. She had built her identity around being the family success story, the one whose accomplishments brought pride and recognition to the Rivers name. The scene unfolding before her suggested that perhaps success could be measured in ways that she had never considered or appreciated. My Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert, Marcus's parents, stood together near the cathedral doors, their grief temporarily overshadowed by confusion about what was happening and why. They had spent years dismissing my military service as an unfortunate choice that had taken me away from more important family obligations. The presence of high-ranking officers treating me with obvious respect challenged assumptions that had guided their treatment of me for decades. The formation of Air Force officers maintained their position with unwavering discipline, their presence creating a visual representation of the institutional respect that I had earned through years of dedicated service. Each officer represented not just individual achievement but collective recognition of contributions that extended far beyond personal accomplishment to encompass service to country, commitment to excellence, and dedication to values that transcended individual ambition. As the moment stretched on, I began to understand that this demonstration had been carefully planned and coordinated by people who understood both the significance of the occasion and the importance of making a statement about loyalty, respect, and the true meaning of family. These officers had taken time from their demanding schedules, traveled significant distances, and organized a complex logistical operation for the sole purpose of ensuring that I did not stand alone during one of the most difficult moments of my personal life. The gesture was unprecedented in my experience, a level of support and recognition that went far beyond routine military courtesy to represent something deeper and more meaningful. It was a public declaration that some bonds are stronger than blood, that some families are chosen rather than inherited, and that some loyalties are earned through mutual respect rather than assumed through genetic connection. General Hayes stepped closer, his expression combining formal respect with genuine warmth. His voice, when he spoke again, carried across the cathedral grounds with perfect clarity, ensuring that every person present could hear and understand the significance of his words. Lieutenant Colonel Rivers, he continued, his tone reflecting both professional respect and personal regard, your service record speaks to exceptional leadership, unwavering dedication, and outstanding achievement under the most challenging circumstances. You have brought honor to the Air Force, credit to your uniform, and pride to everyone who has had the privilege of serving alongside you. The words hit me with unexpected force, not because they were surprising but because they represented public recognition of achievements that my family had never acknowledged or appreciated. Here in front of the people who had spent years dismissing my choices and questioning my priorities, a four-star general was articulating the value and significance of the life I had built through my own efforts and determination. He reached into his jacket and withdrew an official document, its formal appearance suggesting importance and permanence. On behalf of the United States Air Force, he said, I am honored to present you with this commendation recognizing your exceptional service in coordinating humanitarian relief operations that saved countless lives and brought credit to our nation. The presentation of the commendation was conducted with full military ceremony, each gesture calculated to demonstrate respect and recognition while maintaining appropriate dignity for the setting. The other officers maintained their formation throughout the presentation, their discipline and professionalism creating a backdrop that emphasized the significance of the moment. As I accepted the commendation, I felt the weight of not just the physical document but the recognition it represented. Years of dedication, sacrifice, and achievement were being formally acknowledged in front of people who had never understood or appreciated the path I had chosen. The irony was not lost on me that this moment of professional triumph was occurring during a time of personal grief, at the funeral of a cousin who had been part of the family system that had consistently undervalued my contributions to the world. The formation began to move, transitioning from static display to dynamic demonstration as the officers arranged themselves into an honor guard formation that would escort me into the cathedral. Their movements were precise and coordinated, reflecting hours of practice and years of training. The honor guard was not a routine military courtesy, but a special recognition reserved for occasions of particular significance and respect. As we began to move toward the cathedral entrance, I could see my family members struggling to process what they were witnessing. The people who had excluded me from funeral planning, who had made it clear that my presence was unwelcome, who had treated my military service as an embarrassing deviation from acceptable life choices, were now confronted with undeniable evidence that I had earned respect and recognition that extended far beyond their comprehension or approval. The cathedral doors opened as we approached, and I realized that the service would proceed very differently than anyone had planned. Instead of standing alone and unwelcome at the back of the church, I would be entering with an honor guard that commanded respect and attention from everyone present. Instead of being treated as an unwanted intrusion, I would be recognized as someone whose presence added dignity and significance to the occasion. The transformation was complete and irreversible.
In the space of 15 minutes, the narrative that my family had constructed about my place in the world had been challenged, contradicted, and ultimately shattered by a demonstration of respect and loyalty that they could neither dismiss nor deny. The people who had stolen from me, betrayed my trust, and excluded me from family gatherings were now witnessing the kind of recognition that comes from earning respect through service rather than expecting it through birth. As we crossed the threshold into St. Michael's Cathedral, I understood that this moment would mark a fundamental shift in how I understood family, loyalty, and my place in the world. The people who had chosen to honor me with their presence had proven that some relationships are stronger than blood, that some bonds are forged through shared values rather than shared genetics, and that some families are built through mutual respect rather than inherited through accident of birth. The funeral service would continue, Marcus would be properly honored, and grief would be processed in ways that were appropriate and necessary. But everything else had changed, permanently and irrevocably, in ways that would reshape every relationship and redefine every assumption about worth, value, and belonging. The interior of St. Michael's Cathedral fell silent as our procession moved down the center aisle. The honor guard maintained perfect formation, their synchronized footsteps echoing through the vaulted space with measured precision. Every head turned to watch as we passed, the congregation struggling to process the unexpected transformation of what should have been a routine funeral service into something approaching a state ceremony. I walked between the Air Force officers, my bearing steady despite the emotional complexity of the moment. This was Marcus's day, his final farewell, and I was determined to honor his memory with dignity regardless of the family dynamics that had brought us to this point. The honor guard was not about family conflict or personal vindication, but about respect for service, recognition of sacrifice, and the bonds that connect people who have dedicated their lives to something greater than themselves. My family members took their seats in the front pews, their faces reflecting various stages of shock and bewilderment. The whispered conversations that had been circulating through the church since our arrival gradually faded into respectful silence as the service began. Father Mackenzie, the elderly priest who had known our family for decades, seemed momentarily uncertain about how to incorporate the unexpected military presence into his carefully planned liturgy. General Hayes approached the pulpit with quiet authority, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience and the authority of rank, but also the warmth of genuine respect for the occasion and the family gathered to mourn. "We are here today to honor the life of Marcus Rivers," he began, his words measured and appropriate, a young man who brought joy to his family and friends, who lived with passion and enthusiasm, and whose memory will continue to inspire those who knew him. "We are also here to recognize that grief shared is grief diminished, and that the bonds between people who care for each other can provide comfort even in the darkest times." His words were carefully chosen to acknowledge the complexity of the situation without exploiting it, to honor Marcus while also recognizing the broader themes of family, loyalty, and support that had brought the Air Force delegation to Cedar Falls. He spoke about service in terms that encompassed both military duty and civilian contribution, about sacrifice that included both professional commitment and personal loss. When General Hayes returned to his seat, the traditional funeral service continued with readings, hymns, and remembrances that celebrated Marcus's life while acknowledging the profound loss his death represented for everyone who had known him. I participated when appropriate, my voice joining the familiar words of prayers and songs that had been part of family gatherings since childhood, despite the years of distance and misunderstanding that had separated me from these people and these traditions. The eulogy was delivered by Uncle Robert, Marcus's father, whose words painted a picture of a young man who had lived fully despite his short time on Earth. He spoke about Marcus's love of adventure, his infectious enthusiasm for new experiences, his ability to make friends wherever he went, and his deep affection for family despite occasional disagreements and misunderstandings. The portrait was accurate and loving, capturing both Marcus's strengths and his occasional lapses in judgment, his generous spirit and his sometimes impulsive decision-making. As Uncle Robert spoke, I found myself remembering the Marcus I had known during childhood, before family politics and geographic distance had complicated our relationship. He had been the cousin who taught me to ride a bicycle, who had helped me build elaborate snow forts during Colorado winters, who had listened patiently to my dreams about flying airplanes when everyone else seemed to think such ambitions were unrealistic for a girl from Cedar Falls. The loss was real and profound, and the grief I felt was genuine, despite the complications that had defined our adult relationship.
Death has a way of stripping away the accumulated resentments and misunderstandings that can obscure the fundamental connections between people, revealing the love that persists beneath layers of conflict and disappointment. When the service concluded, the honor guard reformed for the procession to the cemetery, their precision and professionalism providing structure and dignity to what could have been a chaotic and emotionally charged situation. The drive to Evergreen Memorial Park was conducted with appropriate solemnity, the Air Force vehicles integrating seamlessly with the civilian funeral procession while maintaining their distinctive military bearing. At the graveside, the honor guard performed the traditional military honors with flawless execution, their movements synchronized and meaningful. The folding and presentation of the flag was conducted with reverence and precision, each fold representing centuries of military tradition and the sacrifice of countless service members who had given their lives in defense of the freedoms that Marcus had enjoyed throughout his civilian life. General Hayes presented the folded flag to Aunt Patricia, with words that honored both Marcus's memory and the family's loss, his gesture encompassing respect for civilian grief, while acknowledging the military traditions that had brought dignity and honor to the ceremony. The moment was powerful and appropriate, connecting the personal loss of a young man's death to the broader themes of service, sacrifice and national commitment that had defined my career and shaped my understanding of duty. As the graveside service concluded and people began to disperse, I found myself approached by family members whose attitudes had been fundamentally altered by the morning's events. The conversations were awkward and tentative, marked by the kind of uncertainty that comes when long-held assumptions are suddenly challenged by undeniable evidence. My mother was the first to approach, her expression reflecting a complex mixture of pride, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment. She spoke carefully, as if testing each word before committing to it, asking questions about my career that she should have asked years earlier, expressing interest in my achievements that would have meant everything to me if it had come at any point during the previous decade. The conversation was polite but strained, marked by the awareness that too much had happened, too much time had passed, and too much damage had been done for simple apologies to bridge the gap that separated us. She mentioned the legal proceedings that were still pending, the financial crimes that had created an irreparable breach of trust, and the years of indifference that had preceded the outright betrayal. When she asked if we could find a way to move forward, to put the past behind us and rebuild some kind of relationship, I found myself responding with honesty that was both kind and firm. The recognition I had received that morning, the respect demonstrated by my Air Force colleagues, and the support shown by people who had chosen to value me for who I was, rather than dismissing me for who I wasn't, had given me a clarity about my priorities and my worth that made certain choices inevitable. I explained that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing, that healing from betrayal required more than acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and that some relationships could not be repaired simply because both parties wanted them to be. The theft had been systematic and sustained, revealing attitudes and assumptions about my worth that extended far beyond simple financial crimes into fundamental questions about respect, family, and mutual regard. My father's approach was different, marked by the kind of formal politeness that had characterized most of our interactions since my childhood. He asked about my rank, my responsibilities, and my future plans with the air of someone making conversation with a respected stranger rather than reconnecting with his daughter. The distance between us was vast and probably unbridgeable, but there was something approaching respect in his manner that had been absent from our previous interactions. Stephanie's reaction was perhaps the most telling because it revealed how little she had understood about the world beyond her own artistic pursuits and social circles. She spoke about my achievements as if they were recent discoveries, rather than the culmination of years of dedicated service that she had been aware of, but had never bothered to investigate or appreciate. Her surprise at the level of recognition I had received suggested that she had fundamentally misunderstood both the significance of my career and the respect it had earned within professional military circles. The conversations with extended family members followed similar patterns, marked by awkward attempts to bridge years of indifference and misunderstanding with suddenly awakened interest in my life and achievements. The recognition that had been so publicly demonstrated by the Air Force Honor Guard had forced them to reconsider assumptions that had guided their treatment of me for decades. But awareness of past mistakes did not automatically translate into the ability to repair relationships that had been damaged by years of neglect and dismissal. As the afternoon wore on, and the formal obligations of the funeral concluded, I found myself faced with decisions about how to move forward, how to process the complex emotions that had been stirred up by the morning's events, and how to integrate the recognition I had received with the grief I was experiencing, and the family dynamics that would continue to complicate my life regardless of any single dramatic gesture. The Air Force officers who had traveled to Cedar Falls for the funeral began their preparations to return to their various duty stations, their mission accomplished and their message delivered with unmistakable clarity. General Hayes took time to speak with me privately before departing, his words carrying both professional respect and personal encouragement for the challenges that lay ahead. He acknowledged that the legal proceedings would continue, that the financial crimes committed by my family would have to be addressed through appropriate channels, and that the path forward would require difficult decisions about relationships and priorities. But he also emphasized that I had earned respect and recognition that could never be taken away, that my achievements were real and significant regardless of whether they were appreciated by people who should have valued them from the beginning. His final words stayed with me long after he had departed. Lieutenant Colonel Rivers, you have proven yourself worthy of every honor you have received and every responsibility you have been given. The people who matter most are the ones who recognize your worth without needing to be reminded of it. Build your life around those relationships, and let the others find their own way to understanding or irrelevance. The weeks that followed Marcus's funeral were marked by a kind of emotional sorting that had been years in the making, but had been accelerated by the events of that October morning. The legal proceedings moved forward with methodical precision, the evidence of financial crimes too overwhelming to challenge or dismiss. My family's attempts to justify their actions, to minimize the significance of their betrayal, and to frame their theft as misunderstood financial management became increasingly desperate and unconvincing as the full scope of their deception was revealed. The criminal charges that were ultimately filed reflected not just the monetary value of what had been stolen, but the systematic nature of the fraud, the abuse of trust it represented, and the impact it had on my financial security and future planning. The legal system processed their crimes with appropriate seriousness, and the consequences they faced were proportional to the damage they had caused and the betrayal they had perpetrated. But the legal resolution, while necessary and appropriate, could not address the deeper emotional wounds that had been opened by years of family indifference and culminated in outright theft. The recognition I had received from my Air Force colleagues had provided a powerful counter-narrative to the story of failure and disappointment that my family had constructed around my life choices, but it could not erase the years of feeling invisible, undervalued, and fundamentally misunderstood by the people who should have supported me unconditionally. The healing that followed was gradual and complex, marked by the need to rebuild my understanding of family, loyalty, and belonging around relationships that were based on mutual respect rather than genetic connection. I found myself investing more deeply in the friendships and professional relationships that had sustained me through years of geographic distance and family rejection, appreciating them more fully for the consistent support and genuine understanding they had provided. I also found myself drawn to service opportunities that allowed me to help other people who were struggling with family rejection, financial abuse, or the challenge of building meaningful lives in the face of systematic undermining by people who should have been sources of support. The experience of being publicly recognized for my achievements while simultaneously grieving the loss of family relationships that had never truly existed gave me a unique perspective on the difference between conditional and unconditional acceptance. One of the most meaningful projects I undertook was the establishment of Veterans Corner, a support service for military personnel who were dealing with family financial abuse or experiencing rejection from relatives who didn't understand or appreciate their service. The program provided both practical resources for addressing financial crimes and emotional support for dealing with the complex grief that comes from losing family relationships that were more fantasy than reality. Working with other service members who had experienced similar betrayals helped me understand that my situation was not unique, that the combination of geographic distance, steady income, and family members who felt entitled to resources they had not earned created conditions that were unfortunately common within military communities. The support group that grew out of Veterans Corner became a kind of chosen family for people who were learning to build meaningful relationships based on shared values rather than shared genetics. The program grew slowly but steadily, providing services to hundreds of military personnel and their families over the years that followed. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding, offering me the opportunity to transform my own painful experiences into resources that could help other people navigate similar challenges with greater support and understanding than I had initially received. General Hayes remained a mentor and friend, checking in regularly and providing guidance as I navigated both my military career and my civilian service projects. His support, along with that of the other officers who had participated in the honor guard at Marcus's funeral, reminded me consistently that recognition and respect were available from people who understood the value of service and the importance of loyalty to principles rather than personalities. The relationship with my biological family evolved into something that could best be described as cordial but distant. The legal proceedings had concluded with appropriate consequences for their crimes, but the emotional aftermath continued to shape our interactions in ways that made genuine intimacy impossible. We exchanged holiday cards and occasional updates about major life events, but the deep trust and unconditional support that should characterize family relationships had been permanently damaged by their choices, and could not be restored through good intentions alone. Marcus's memory remained important to me, and I continued to honor him in ways that felt authentic and meaningful despite the complications that surrounded his funeral and the family dynamics that had preceded his death. I visited his grave regularly, bringing flowers and spending quiet time remembering the boy who had taught me to ride a bicycle and dream about adventures beyond the boundaries of Cedar Falls. The irony was not lost on me that Marcus's death had ultimately brought clarity to relationships and priorities that had been clouded by years of misunderstanding and manipulation. The honor guard that had escorted me into St. Michael's Cathedral had represented more than military courtesy. It had been a demonstration of the kind of family bonds that are forged through shared values, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's welfare. As I reflected on the journey that had brought me from the awkward girl who didn't fit into family gatherings to the Air Force officer who commanded respect from colleagues and superiors, I realized that the most important lesson had been learning to distinguish between relationships that nurtured growth and those that demanded conformity to expectations that were neither realistic nor healthy. The recognition I had received throughout my military career had been meaningful not because it validated my worth to people who had never appreciated it, but because it reflected the genuine respect of people who understood the significance of service, sacrifice, and commitment to principles larger than personal comfort or convenience. The morning I had stood outside St. Michael's Cathedral, feeling isolated and unwelcome at my own cousin's funeral, had marked the end of my efforts to earn acceptance from people who were incapable of providing it, and the beginning of my full appreciation for the family I had chosen, and the relationships I had built through my own efforts and integrity. The honor guard that had formed around me that day had represented not just military protocol but the fundamental truth that some bonds are stronger than blood, that some families are forged through choice rather than chance, and that the most meaningful recognition comes from people who understand your worth without needing to be convinced of it. Years later, as I continued to serve both my country and my fellow veterans through various programs and initiatives, I carried with me the memory of that October morning when everything changed, when the narrative I had been told about my value and my place in the world was challenged and ultimately replaced by a truth that was both more challenging and more rewarding than anything I had previously imagined. The lesson that emerged from that experience was simple but profound. Family is not about who shares your genetics, but about who shares your values, supports your growth, and stands with you when the world seems determined to leave you standing alone. The honor guard that had formed around me during my darkest moment had proven that such family exists, that it can be found and nurtured, and that it provides the kind of support and recognition that makes all the struggles and sacrifices worthwhile. The story that had begun with exclusion and betrayal had evolved into one of recognition and belonging, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating those who have wronged you, but from finding those who value you for who you truly are, and building a life worthy of their respect and support. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.